Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We want to welcome you, and we're very excited about this conference today entitled Exploring Origins and Impacts of Beliefs About Genetic Causation. This conference is sponsored by our Columbia Center for Research on Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications of Psychiatric, Neurologic, and Behavioral Genetics. And my name is Ruth Ottman, and I am the Deputy Director of the Center. And the director is Paul Applebaum, who is the Elizabeth K. Dollard Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law here at Columbia University. Paul, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Ruth, and hi, everybody. Our center has been in place for 13 years now, first as a 3-year developing center, and then for 10 years as a full-fledged center of excellence in ELSI research, or SEER for short. And ELSI research, as I think you all know, is research on the ethical, legal, and social implications of advances in genetics, and our focus has been, as Ruth said, on psychiatric, neurologic, and behavioral genetics. And we're funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute at NIH. This has been a fantastic run, and we have sponsored conferences like this one every year for the last 10 years. And sadly, this conference is our last in the series, since the SEER program is being ended by NHGRI. And so our center will be sunsetting as well. However, given that this seems like a fitting time to note the range of activities we've sponsored over the last 13 years with the help of our partners at the Hastings Center, several of whom will be on our program today. We've sponsored research exploring topics as diverse as the use of behavioral genetic data in criminal trials, the impact of genetic test results for people with autism, and ethics and policy issues related to individualized treatments for children with rare genetic disorders. We've sponsored a postdoctoral fellowship that has produced a string of faculty members here at Columbia, one of whom you'll be hearing from today and elsewhere, who focus on ELSI research. We've sponsored a monthly seminar series on ethical issues and ethical, legal, and social issues related to genetics with leading researchers from the US and countries as geographically far-flung as Argentina, Australia, and Israel. And for the last 3 years, since the pandemic began, they have been online and therefore accessible to more people than ever in the US and in countries abroad as well. We've had an annual short course for faculty and trainees on ELSI research methods, which Ruth has coordinated. And we've published a monthly newsletter, Brain Gen Ethics Update, which summarizes recently published research on ethical, legal, social issues in psychiatric, neurologic, and behavioral genetics, as well as covering major advances in the genetics of these conditions. And for this, our final conference after 13 years, we've got a terrific set of speakers. And as Ruth said, we're very excited about the program today and glad that so many of you can join us. So I'm going to turn this back to Ruth now to tell you more about the agenda for the next 4 hours.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's, it makes me pretty emotional to hear that summary of what we've been up to for the last 10 years. Trip down memory lane. For this conference, we decided to focus on our long-standing interest in the psychosocial and behavioral impacts of genetic research and practice. But it's a little different from our previous approaches because we wanted to delve more deeply into how people think about genetic causation, beginning with how people think about causation in general, and then covering what special issues arise in the context of genetic causes. The first session will address these concepts from a theoretical point of view, and the second will discuss more empirical approaches, although both of the sessions will include some empirical analyses. Last night, I emailed the conference program to all of the people who registered, but if you didn't get a copy of it, I've included a link in the chat that you can use to access the conference. As I said, as Paul said, we have an outstanding set of speakers, and you will find more information about them in the brochure, the conference program. But I thought we should just take a moment for each of you speakers to say a little bit about yourselves before we actually begin. Eric, do you want to begin?
Sure, thanks, Ruth. I'm Eric Perrins. I work at the Hastings Center, which, for those of you who don't know, is a bioethics research institute in Garrison, New York. I have an interdisciplinary background in the humanities, but I have been working with Paul and Ruth on the center for as long as it's been around. It's terrific to be here.
Thank you. Tanya?
Hi, my name is Tanya Lombroso. I am a professor of psychology at Princeton University. And broadly speaking, I'm a cognitive psychologist who's interested in how it is that we think and reason about the world, including specifically the explanations that we seek and find satisfying. So I'll be speaking about that in a bit.
Perfect. Matt?
Hi, my name is Matt Lebowitz. I'm an assistant professor here at Columbia in the Department of Psychiatry. I've been part of the CEER, the center here, since I began my postdoc in 2016. And I focus in my research on how people think about genetic and other kinds of biological and biomedical explanations for health, particularly mental health, as well as behavior and identity more broadly, and how those kinds of thought processes affect social attitudes and other kinds of beliefs.
Thank you. Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate Lynch. I'm a philosopher of science, and I work in the History and Philosophy of Science department at the University of Melbourne. I'm interested in causation and explanation more broadly, and how philosophical theories and problems that come up with causation and explanation map into biological systems like genetics.
Thank you. Josie?
Morena, good morning, everyone. Where I am, I'm Josephine Johnston. I'm a senior research scholar at the Hastings Centre and remotely, but I'm also a teacher at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And I was part of the CEER when I was located in the United States. And I'm interested in a number of things, including some bioethics and legal and policy issues around the integration of genetics into healthcare and life.
Thank you so much, Josie. Josie has agreed to take on the very difficult task of summarizing what she's heard today and leading the discussion that we'll have at the end. I just wanted to say that, you know, we have allocated plenty of time for discussion. So each of the talks will be 30 minutes, followed by 15 minutes for discussion. And then we've allocated another 30 minutes at the end for a general discussion covering everything that we've heard. During the discussion period, you can ask questions in the chat, and we will read them to you. We'll be monitoring that, or you can unmute yourself and turn your video on and raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of the screen to access the raise hand icon. Okay, so I think with that, we are ready to begin. And our first talk will be Tanya Lombroso speaking about the human drive to explain, lessons from developmental and cognitive psychology.
All right, Great. So if that's all working, you should hopefully see my slides now and be able to hear me. As I mentioned before, I work broadly on issues having to do with the psychology of explanation, including why we're so driven to explain and what sorts of explanations we find satisfying. And so what I thought I would do was start with some sort of general high-level principles about how it is that we evaluate and think about explanations that I think might apply specifically to the case of genetic explanation. To start with, we know that from pretty much the moment that they can begin putting together multi-word sentences, children will request explanations. And this tendency persists, at least for most of us, in some form through to adulthood. And we're not only highly demanding in the sense that we sometimes care very much about whether or not we get an explanation, we're also demanding in the sense that we have particular sorts of preferences for what kinds of explanations we're going to consider plausible and satisfying. And one of the things that I've argued in my work is that in some ways this can explain some of humans' greatest successes, right? So how it is that we're such good learners throughout our childhood, and how it is that the search for explanations can be so effective in driving scientific progress. But there's also ways in which our explanatory preferences can sometimes lead us astray and lead us to perhaps, oversimplify or misrepresent the kind of structure that we actually find in the world. So my plan is to talk about some of these psychological factors that might help us understand, on the one hand, the allure of genetic explanations in particular, but then also to think about some of the dangers that might come from these psychological factors in how it is that we favor some explanations over others, or perhaps misunderstand the actual causal structure of the world. What I decided to do was focus on 4 general features of explanation for which we have good evidence that people show a preference, and that I think might be especially relevant in thinking about genetic explanations. I should say this list is not exhaustive. There's other things I could have had on here as well, and I'm happy to talk about additional features of explanations as they come up in the Q&A. But the 4 that I'm going to talk about are simplicity, stability, reduction, and teleology, which I will say more about as we go. I should also qualify this claim that when I'm talking about genetic explanations in this talk, really what I'm thinking about is lay people's understanding of genetic explanations. And so really we're thinking about folk genetic explanations, which are probably going to themselves be very simplified relative to the actual kinds of explanations that geneticists are considering. All right, so what do we mean by simplicity in the context of people's evaluations of explanations? So one way to think about this is in the context of causal explanations. So suppose that you observe 2 effects. We're just going to call them E1 and E2. One way that you could explain these is by appeal to a single cause, say cause 1, that accounts for both of these effects. And we can contrast this explanation with an explanation that appeals to 2 independent causes where each of them is sufficient to explain these effects. So there's been quite a lot of research in psychology to suggest that people prefer explanations more like the single cause case than like the 2 cause case in structures like this. And you can get a little bit more sophisticated and give people situations where there's actually quite a lot of probabilistic evidence about what's actually more likely to be true. And what you find is that above and beyond what's more likely given the evidence that they have, people show a preference for explanations that have the first structure rather than the second. Turns out that what people are doing in showing this preference is not merely counting the number of causes in the explanation. So take a case like this, where now we have more causes that are being invoked to explain these 2 effects. C4, C5, and C6. So we have 3 causes rather than 1 or 2. But those 2 causes, C5 and C6, can be explained by appeal to a common cause, C4. And it turns out that people prefer explanations like this with a sort of common cause structure over an explanation like the one in the middle, which has 2 independent causes. So it seems like what people favor in explanations are cases where you have to posit the fewest number of causes that are themselves unexplained, right? So because C4 plausibly explains C5 and C6, it seems like we might get some benefits there in terms of simplicity or parsimony. So what does this mean in the genetic case? So I don't know of evidence looking at this systematically in the case of genetic explanations. And so I did tried and true method of seeing how many Google News headlines might suggest that people show this sort of preference when it comes to genetic explanations. And in fact, if you search for things like explanations appealing to genes in headlines, you find a large number of cases where people do seem to be appealing to single genes to do a lot of explanatory work. In fact, this last headline here, single gene insufficient to account for a particular effect, right? The fact that it's newsworthy that one single gene would be insufficient suggests that maybe people have a prior expectation that in many cases one gene might be sufficient. The problem here is that the real genetic landscape is of course much more complicated. So these are just 2 images that I pulled from papers that are trying to represent something about the actual structure of genetic causation. And of course, these themselves themselves are extremely schematized and extremely simplified. But the point is that the causal structure of the world is likely to be really complex in lots of cases. And so the danger that emerges from this particular explanatory preference towards simpler explanations is that if people have a preference that misaligns with the actual causal structure where they're trying to explain, there's three kinds of problematic consequences that we might worry about. So one is that people might simply disfavor or not be satisfied by explanations that are in fact quite complicated. Another concern is that people might find those explanations implausible, right? So they'll refuse to accept an explanation because it doesn't fit the form of what they consider to be a good explanation. And a third possibility is that people might systematically misrepresent the actual causal structure of the world in thinking about genetic causation because they're trying to get it to conform to their sort of ideal of what would be a more satisfying explanation in terms of this dimension of simplicity. All right, the second property that I want to talk about that affects people's evaluations of explanations is one that's referred to as stability, at least in the philosophy of science literature. And the basic idea here is that the stability of a causal relationship has to do with whether or not it would continue to hold in a range of background circumstances that might not be specified. So here's an example of what you might think is a relatively stable causal relationship. So if we talk about the causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer, or we explain an instance of lung cancer by appeal to somebody smoking, this isn't going to be a perfectly deterministic relationship. But this kind of causal relationship is going to hold despite variation in lots of background circumstances that we haven't mentioned. So for example, we haven't said whether the person smokes with their right hand or their left hand. We haven't said what brand of cigarettes they smoke. We haven't said anything about what their blood type is. And it seems like despite this variation in all sorts of other variables that we haven't specified, there's still going to be a pretty reliable relationship between smoking and an increase in the rate of lung cancer. And so you might say that this relationship is therefore relatively stable. We can contrast this with something like a causal relationship between a particular gene and lung cancer. And here it's very, very likely that this is not going to be a highly stable relationship, right? It's probably going to be dependent on lots of other unspecified background circumstances, like for example, whether or not the person smokes or whether or not the person is exposed to other kinds of environmental conditions. So we know from psychological research that people tend to favor explanations that are more stable in this sense. That is, causal explanations that appeal to causal relationships that tend to be relatively invariant across variation and unspecified background conditions. So I'm just going to give you one concrete example of what that looks like in terms of a particular case. So this comes from a study with my former postdoc, Naya Basel, who's also a terrific artist. And so we got these great stimuli for these weird creatures called zelmos. And participants learned about these zelmos, and they learned about a relationship between their diet and whether or not they have sore antennas. And so they'd be given data in a form like this, where they basically get to see the covariation between an aspect of their diet and developing sore antennas. We would then break down this relationship based on some other background factor that until this point was unspecified. And this has to do with whether they drink salty water or drink fresh water. And for half the participants, when you do an experiment where you split up whether or not they eat yonas or not, and you measure whether or not they have sore antennas, and you systematically vary whether they drink salt water or fresh water, what you see is that it doesn't really matter what kind of water they're drinking. There seems to be some association between eating yonas in the past week and having sore antennas. By contrast, for another group of participants, they would get data that looks like this, where in fact there's a very strong association between eating yonas and having sore antennas in the case where they drink salty water, but pretty much no association in the case where they drink fresh water. So to use vocabulary that may be familiar to some of you, we could say that in the top case, the relationship between diet and sore antennas is not moderated by type of water. And in the bottom case, the relationship is moderated by type of water. Now, the critical thing here is that at the population level, right? So if we just ignore whether they're drinking salt water or fresh water, the relationship between eating yonas and having sore antennas is equally strong. It's just whether or not there's this background factor of what type of water they drink that also makes a difference. And so what we did is that we had participants evaluate a variety of causal and explanatory claims, things like, for a particular zelmo named Timmy, that eating yonas caused its antennas to become sore, an explanatory version of that claim, and also other versions of the claims that had to do not with an individual creature here, but with the whole population. And I should say, I'm just showing you one example of many different kinds of items and cover stories that we use for this. Participants basically had to tell us how much they agreed with these claims. And the critical finding that we replicated across actually several experiments was that people are happier making these kinds of causal and explanatory claims when the causal relationship that they're evaluating or that's invoked in the explanation is not moderated. That is, when it's about equally strong across variation in these unspecified background circumstances. So if we think about what this means for the case of thinking about genetic explanations, one thing we might wonder about is to what extent do people favor genetic explanations that are relatively stable in this sense? That is, favor genetic explanations that do not involve variation across background circumstances. Here, I had a hard time trying to find evidence in the form of headlines. What I can tell you is I failed to find any case where at least a headline talked about a genetic relationship being moderated by some factor. What I found was this. So here the relationship between whether coffee and its impact is being affected by the genes as the background factor, rather than the gene itself causing something in a way that is or isn't moderated by these other kinds of considerations. But I think that the broader story here is that I think there's a danger where, because we prefer explanations that are more stable, we might tend to prefer some sorts of explanations over others, but in particular, perhaps disfavor or misunderstand genetic explanations that do involve a serious role for other kinds of genetic or environmental factors in affecting the way that the genetic relationship manifests in a particular case, right? So the thought is here that, typically genetic causation, genetic relationships will involve a great deal of background factors that matter. And so if people tend to ignore those, that might be dangerous in terms of people's understanding of genetic causation and explanation. The third factor I want to talk about is reduction. So here I'm going to appeal to a really intriguing phenomenon that was documented by a group of researchers led by Dina Weisberg. And what they found was that lay people tended to favor explanations that incorporated jargon or terminology from a lower level of analysis. And here what I mean by lower level of analysis is that if you imagine a sort of hierarchy of the sciences where perhaps physics is sort of at a relatively basic level, and then we have chemistry and biology and neuroscience, and psychology and social sciences and so on. Often when you give explanations, they can be sort of horizontal in the sense that they appeal to other things at that level of analysis. But sometimes we also give reductive explanations where, for example, you might explain something in chemistry by appeal to physics, or you might explain something in psychology by appeal to neuroscience. And so what she found was a preference for reductive explanations in the following sense. So the contrast was between explanations like this, where, for example, you're explaining some effect by appeal to some content, and you contrast that with an explanation that has the same content, but additionally adds in some reductive information, some sort of jargon or claim from a lower level. So for example, this could be explaining something about human behavior, where you just appeal to other things about psychology, that would be a horizontal explanation, or where you also mention a gene or a hormone or something else that draws from a lower level of analysis. The critical thing about the way that they tested this was that they consulted with experts to make sure that the extra information that was being added from the lower level was not actually explanatorily relevant. So by experts' lights, these reductive explanations were no better than non-reductive explanations, but the question was how lay people would evaluate them. So here's an example of the sorts of things that participants were asked to evaluate. This is just one example among many, but here participants were given a question like, why do male lizards bob their heads when other males are nearby? And participants would see just one of 4 possible explanations. And those explanations varied along 2 dimensions. So one way they varied was being better or worse, good or bad. And the way that these were constructed, the bad explanations were nearly circular. So they basically tended to sort of re-describe what was already presupposed or implied by the question without really giving you much more explanatory content. The good explanations were intended to be better in the sense that they actually did furnish some additional information that was explanatorily relevant. The critical manipulation was whether or not they added this reductive information. So in this case, where you're explaining the behavior of a lizard, the reductive information would be that aggressive behavior is known to be associated with elevated levels of testosterone and other aggression-enabling hormones. So by virtue of appealing to testosterone and hormones, the idea is that this is adding in a sort of neuroscientific level of analysis and is therefore a partially reductive explanation. Right, here's what they found in terms of people's ratings of explanation quality. And I realize there's tons of data on this figure. So to start out, just if you look at the far left, you'll see the summary across all sciences. And the first thing you'll notice is the first 2 bars are much higher than the next 2 bars. That's good news. It means that people think the good explanations are better than the bad explanations. That's somewhat reassuring. But you'll see that the second and fourth bars are also higher than the first and the third. And those are the explanations that were additionally given this reductive information that, at least according to experts, was explanatorily irrelevant. And what you can see is that that led to a significant boost in how good people thought those explanations were. And so this suggests that for lay people, adding in this reductive information boosts the perceived quality of explanations. And moreover, that this boost seems to be indiscriminate with respect to whether or not the explanation is pretty good or bad, right? So even for bad explanations, they're going to be perceived to be better when they get this reductive information added to them. Looking at the headline test, we can see that I think there's a lot of interest in these kinds of reductive explanations. It seems like people are very interested in cases where it seems like genes can explain what we think of as perhaps a psychological or higher level of analysis. But the danger here is that these data suggest that people are not well equipped to be able to evaluate the quality of these kinds of explanations. Right? From the perspective of lay people, they might be subject to the illusion that these are better explanations than they are, just by virtue of the fact that they include this reductive level of analysis. All right, the final example that I want to talk about, and I'll give you the examples I have from some of my own research that get closer to genetic explanations specifically, is the property of teleology in explanations. So teleological or functional explanations are explanations that appeal to a function, purpose, or goal. And there's a few ways in which genetic explanations could have an element of teleology. So for example, if you're trying to explain why a species has a particular gene or why individuals of that species have a particular gene, and somebody offers the explanation that it's because it's for some particular function F, that would be an example of a sort of teleological way of thinking about the presence or persistence of that gene. If you ask, why does species S have some particular trait, and you answer that it's because the species members have a particular gene and that gene is for that trait, that can be construed as a sort of teleological way of thinking about that gene. So one thing that we know from a couple of decades of research in developmental psychology is that people tend to extend this sort of teleological reasoning beyond its sort of proper scientific bounds. So Deborah Kellerman, a developmental psychologist, has called this phenomenon promiscuous teleology. And she's documented the following with young children. So like adults, young children will very readily ascribe functions to human-made artifacts, like saying that forks are for eating or that clocks are for telling time. But many young children will also say that mountains are for climbing. That's why there are mountains. Birds are for flying. That's why there are birds, and so on. And while a lot of, at least Western educated adults, will tend not to accept these latter sorts of teleological explanations, where you extend a function to an aspect of the non-biological natural world, like a mountain, or to an entire biological organism, like a bird, you do find adults, many adults, I should say, there's variation here, many adults agreeing with statements like the ones that I've put down here before, where at least on a lot of construals of these are sort of scientifically problematic sorts of claims to make. Yet it seems like many people think that these are pretty good explanations for example, why earthworms tunnel underground to aerate the soil, and so on. You also find this sort of teleological language, casually in the way that people talk about genes, right? So again, this is the headlines from Google News test, but it was really easy to find many examples of people using the term a gene for something. I think that way of talking about genes is not always teleological in the sense, but it often is. So for example, the first article here, gene for brain size. So you might imagine explaining why does somebody have a particular brain size? Because they have the gene for that, right? And so on. So what's the danger here? I think there's a few dangers, and some of them have to do with the causal presuppositions that come from these kinds of functional explanations applied to many genetic cases. But I want to point out what I think is a more subtle and perhaps more pernicious kind of danger that comes from cases like this. And the initial way to demonstrate this comes from my example of a zebra. So suppose you ask, why do zebras have stripes? And you give a functional explanation like it's for camouflage from predators. There's evidence from my lab and some work from others as well, that when you give a functional explanation for a biological trait in this way, people often make an inference to a normative claim, like zebras should therefore have stripes. And these sorts of normative inferences about what properties an organism ought to have, should have, are potentially problematic, especially when you think of certain kinds of human cases. And so in thinking about the dangers, we can ask, do people reason about humans this way, right? Do people ask questions like what humans are for, or think about humans as a species in teleological terms? And how do they think about what genes or biological components are for? And might this have certain kinds of dangers in thinking about the kinds of normative inferences that people would draw? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from very recent work in my lab showing this sort of pattern of inference that follows from these sorts of explanatory tendencies. So in these initial studies, we asked people basically to indicate true or false to a variety of claims that stated that humans had particular purposes or functions. And these were designed to span a variety of domains that we thought people might plausibly hold these beliefs. So these are just examples from 5 different categories that we tested. They had to do with reproductive functions. They had to do with helping others, with living a fulfilling life, protecting the environment, and so on. So for example, participants would indicate true or false for whether or not humans exist in order to procreate and perpetuate the species, or the human race exists so that it can care for the earth. And for each of these categories, a function that we thought people might or might not attribute to the human species, we had a corresponding moral claim. So for example, the corresponding claim for humans exist in order to procreate and perpetuate the species would be that people who do not procreate and perpetuate the species are, and participants could indicate moral or immoral. And so the prediction here is that to the extent that people are inclined to construe something in these more teleological or functional terms, they might be more likely to think that it is morally wrong to fail to fulfill that species function. So that's what we found. So what I'm showing here along the x-axis is the extent to which participants agreed with these sorts of claims that attributed a function to the purpose of humans. And along the y-axis is how much they agreed that it was immoral for people to not engage in this, the corresponding behavior to fulfill that function. And what you can see is that people who were more likely to agree with claims like humans exist in order to procreate were also more likely to agree with claims like people who do not procreate are immoral. We have some evidence for the causal for what's driving these sorts of effects. So we tested in a variety of ways, but I'll just show you the final experiment that returned to the case of humans. It looks like part of what's going on here is that when you make these sorts of teleological ascriptions, people infer that there's some benefit to that property, which then licenses the normative claim. So for example, people vary in the extent to which they agree that the human species exists in order to protect nature. But those people who endorse that claim are more likely to think that protecting nature is beneficial for the human species, and in turn to think that it is morally wrong for people to choose not to protect nature. So it looks like part of what's driving this relationship between beliefs about the purpose of the species and beliefs about what's morally right or wrong are these inferences that people make about something being beneficial to the species by virtue of this teleological claim. So the last finding I'm going to show you tries to extend this link more closely to thinking about the genetic cases in particular. And unfortunately, for the purposes of this audience in this talk, what we looked at was not specifically manipulating whether or not something had a genetic basis, but basically telling people that it was innate or not. And then we looked at whether or not that had consequences for how they think about, in this case, mothers was the target category. So participants learned about a team of researchers at Stanford School of Medicine who conducted an analysis of lots of blood samples of biological mothers of infants. And they found that the majority of these had a chemical called rhodexin in their blood, whereas a control group of fathers and women without children did not have rhodexin in their blood. And then what we manipulated between subjects was we told them that basically this was innate, that it was a byproduct of pregnancy, that it was found in the blood of previous generations of biological mothers, or we told them specifically that it was caused by modern medical practices and that it was not in the blood of previous generations of biological mothers. And so now this allows us to ask, what inferences follow for people from just learning that this is or isn't innate in this sense? Are they going to infer, in the case that it's innate, that it actually serves a function? Will that lead them to think it has particular benefits? And will that lead them to make normative claims? So for this first manipulation, you've seen that we varied whether or not we told participants that it was innate or not. We then asked them whether or not they thought that rhodexin was functional in the sense that it served an evolutionary purpose for mothers. And what you can see is that when we told them that it was innate, the vast majority, 91%, thought that it did serve a function. In the case where it's not innate, the majority thought that it did not. We then experimentally manipulated this. So for those who had learned that it was innate, we actually told them actually this did serve an evolutionary function for mothers. For the other ones, we told them it actually didn't. It was just sort of a genetic byproduct. And we asked them whether or not they thought it might have benefits for mothers or infants in today's environment. And in the case where it had an evolutionary function, the vast majority thought that it would have a benefit in today's environment. And in the other cases, they thought that it probably would not. And then finally, this is, I think, where things get more potentially relevant. We then told them whether or not it actually does have benefits or not. So in the case where it had benefits, we told them that having rhodexin in your blood actually reduces pain during childbirth. And we told them that it reduced pain during childbirth, either for the mother or for the infant. So the function could be for the self or for other, or that it had no benefits today. And we then asked them how much they agreed with the claim that mothers ought to have rhodexin in their blood. And what we found was that variation in endorsement on the 7-point scale with this particular claim varied depending on whether or not it had a benefit. And so I'm going to show you these final column of data in a slightly easier to digest form. So this is showing you the mean rating with the claim that mothers ought to have rhodexin in their blood as a function of whether they learned that it was innate and did have an evolutionary function, innate and had no function, or not innate at all, and whether or not the benefit that it had to do with mothers, infants, or no benefit at all. And there's a few things going on here, but really the main takeaway is that when participants learned that it had a benefit, they were more likely to think that mothers ought to have this. Okay, I've shown you a lot of data, but here's really the point that I want to make for the purposes of this presentation and the topic of today's talks. What you see here is that when people learn that something is innate, and I presume our participants were thinking about this in terms of a genetic basis, we just didn't assess that or manipulate that directly. The vast majority, 91%, assume that it has an evolutionary function. And when they think it has an evolutionary function, the vast majority think that it's beneficial in today's environment. And when they think it's beneficial in today's environment, they think that one ought to have that feature. And so what we're seeing here is this like ready chain of inferences that go from the genetic basis to what ought to be the case for individuals today. And I think probably it doesn't take an enormous amount of imagination to come up with cases where this would be very problematic in terms of the way that people think about individuals or groups. Okay, so I started out thinking about these 4 different characteristics that seem to affect our explanatory preferences. We know from lots of research, including the research I told you about, but also lots more I haven't had a chance to tell you about, that people tend to prefer explanations that are simple, stable, involve reductant content, and involve a function or purpose. So I think that gives us something like a template for what might be the most satisfying kind of genetic explanation for somebody, right? It would be something that explains a trait or whatever it is that you're trying to explain by appeal to just a single cause that's stable in the sense that its effects do not depend a lot on variation in background circumstances. By virtue of invoking a gene, it's going to be reductive. And to the extent that people can construe this in more teleological terms as telling you something about the purpose or function of that gene or the trait, that's probably going to be favored even more. And so I think this has a few consequences, right? So one of them is that people might have systematic preferences for some kinds of genetic explanations or others, or in particular just prefer certain kinds of genetic explanations. I think it might mean that people find certain kinds of explanations more or less plausible or persuasive as a result of how closely they approximate this sort of ideal. And I think you might expect that people are going to make systematic errors where they're going to misunderstand causal systems, draw faulty inferences as a result of trying to think about more of the world than we ought to through this lens of what it is that might make an ideal or most satisfying explanation. So that leads to some of the dangers that we've talked about, where I think for all of these properties, there's a corresponding set of plausible misunderstandings and plausible problematic inferences that might arise. So I will stop there with many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That was, for those of us who think about gene-environment interaction and genetic complexity and how to convey that to people, it's very, very useful to hear the fundamentals, of how people tend to think about genetics. Very eye-opening to me. Are there comments from the floor? I'm looking in the chat.
Bob has his hand up, Ruth.
Okay, Bob, sure.
Thank you. That was great. I have a question about, and I don't know if you or other colleagues of yours have looked at this, how people and when people changed their causal explanation. So if people believe X is the cause, and then they're given new evidence, whether it's about a gene or something else, the likelihood or how they think about sort of switching their explanation.
So the short answer is that yes, there is a lot of explanation, a lot of research on that. I think it's hard to give generalizations about when they will versus won't. I can tell you some of the factors that matter. So one thing that's going to matter is the prior probability they assign to that explanation, right? Sort of how confident they are in the initial explanation. Another thing that's likely to matter is how personally relevant or important that explanation is to them, right? So if it's about something that they're not at all personally invested in, they're more likely to readily update in light of evidence. If it's something that's somehow very tied to their identity, where they feel like there's a lot at stake, they're going to typically be more resistant. There's also some evidence that people are more likely to change their explanation when they have some viable candidate to change their explanation to. right? So if you only have anomalies or counter evidence with respect to your current view, but you don't yet have a really plausible alternative, you might be less likely to give up on the one viable explanation that you have. The last kind of case that comes to mind is that there's certain cases where changing your causal explanation could involve what's called conceptual change. So that would be a case where, for example, if you have a child who's learning about natural selection for the first time, and they have a particular explanation for why an organism developed some feature, and it's an inaccurate explanation in the sense that it appeals to something like a Lamarckian idea of inheritance, for that child to change their explanation and adopt a more accurate, sort of Darwinian sort of explanation, they might need to develop different concepts of what a species is, or different ways of even thinking about that domain. So psychologists refer to that as conceptual change, when you really have to formulate your explanation over sort of like different concepts themselves. And that's a really challenging kind of learning, right? I mean, I think this is what we see in the history of science. It's what we see in cognitive development when children radically restructure the way they're thinking about the world. It's something that we encounter in the context of science education. And so that would be another case where it would be especially challenging.
Thank you. Anna Lewis is asking, in your view, what makes for a correct explanation? Or is that an ill-formed question?
I think that is it's a great question, and I'm trying to think if I can give a correct explanation for that question. There's a lot that could be said here. So I think some people have a view of explanations as being sort of like facts out there in the world. And that's not the way that I tend to think about explanations. So I tend to think about explanations as being particular to a person who's asking them in a given context. And so when we're asking for an explanation, why X, we're typically asking like why X implicitly as opposed to why, right? So if I say, why did, famous example from the philosophy of science literature, if I feel like, why did Adam eat the apple? I might mean like as opposed to Eve. If I say, why did Adam eat the apple? I mean like as opposed to the pear. He could have eaten the pear. Why did he eat the apple? And so very often in real world communicative exchanges, a why question underspecifies what it is that you're actually looking for. And so typically, you have to take a given why question, you have to fill in a lot of things about what's actually being asked in a more precise way. And then a good explanation is going to be one that identifies something that makes a difference to why it's the case that you observe X, as opposed to that kind of implicit or explicit counterfactual alternative Y. Like roughly, that's the kind of picture of explanation that I have. And so when we're thinking about explanations being good or satisfying, often it's whether or not they satisfy that structure from the perspective of the person who's the explanation requester. And then we can additionally ask questions like, are the claims that are made as part of the explanation true or not? And so in that sense, we can evaluate whether or not it's a correct explanation. But there might be lots of things that are, perfectly correct statements that are legitimate responses to one question, but are not going to be correct explanations in response to this question because it's something else that's being demanded under that circumstance.
We have someone saying good night from Finland.
Ruth, can I?
Yes, go ahead, Paul.
Ask,
Yes.
Tanya, a lot of us in the ELSI world have recognized for a long time a variety of problems, not nearly as elegantly laid out as you've presented them to us, with people's understandings of genetic information, in particular, and what the implications are for their health or behavior or the like. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about how to improve understanding. How do we get around some of these natural tendencies to misinterpret? And this may relate to Anna's question of you can't have a misinterpretation unless you have some sense of what a more correct explanation would be. But I'm wondering if you have at all looked at ways of modifying the tendencies that people might have to be overly reductive, overly simplistic, favoring stable as opposed to transient contexts, and thereby helping them better understand the information.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not in my own research looked at that at all in the context of genetic explanations. But if I think about the body of research that exists more generally for the four features that I talked about, there's some things that we can say. So with regard to simplicity, there is some evidence that people's preferences for explanations depend in part on their expectations about the complexity of the domain. So people might be more willing to accept complicated explanations in psychology, for example, than in physics, in part because in psychology, they expect the domain to be more complicated if there to be more causes than they do for physics. And so one thing that could change in terms of people's education is just understanding the complexity of what it is that they're trying to explain. Might help them appreciate that the causes have to be correspondingly complex. With regard to stability, I don't know if any interventions that push people towards a greater appreciation for stability. In some sense, the data are already optimistic there, because what we find in our studies is that just giving people evidence that a relationship is not stable already makes them like the causal claims less and the explanation claims less. And so that's a case where it might be that merely giving people the data is kind of enough to have them back down from the unqualified kinds of generalizations. With regard to reduction, I think the most optimistic piece of data there are that you don't seem to get the same sorts of effects with increasing expertise. So if I remember correctly, the data from those papers, expertise didn't typically, small amounts of expertise didn't eliminate the effects, but I think some expertise did reduce those sorts of effects. And that suggests that the general things that we're trying to do in terms of teaching people to be more sophisticated scientific reasoners, statistical readers, and so on, probably have some effect there. And the last one in terms of teleology, that's a really tricky one. So there is evidence for individual variation across people and when they seem to accept scientifically unwarranted teleological sorts of explanations. You find that people who've had Western science education tend to be somewhat more restrictive in what they will think about in teleological terms. PhD scientists and PhDs in the humanities show lower baseline levels of accepting some of these explanations than lay populations, but even they accept them at a reasonably high rate. For a lot of these, there's also some real controversy about which ones are the scientifically unwarranted ones and which ones are okay. I don't think all of them are totally clear cut. But that does suggest that education plays a role there. For that case, my own view is that the place we'd really want to intervene isn't maybe so much in whether people think about it functionally or not. I mean, that can be problematic in some cases. It's really the inferences from it being functional or serving some function to the idea that it ought to be that way, or that there would be something wrong with it not being that way. And I think that's a really interesting case to think about, how we could break that link. I'm seeing some questions in chat. Should I just take these or?
Larry Brody is asking, well, Paul, are there really natural tendencies, or is it he's addressing it to you, Paul? Or is it just that people apply what they were taught during their K-12 phase of learning? Larry, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself?
Sure, I was just reacting to the other questions about what's correct, what's not correct, as opposed to what we've learned. And I think that we teach genetics wrong. We have been teaching it wrong for a very long time. And the same is true with evolutionary biology, because we go for the easy stuff, not the hard stuff. And I don't know if there's a population out there that exists that has never had to do Punnett squares in their high school or junior high, and wonder if they would have the same views that Tanya, you're seeing in your respondents. I don't know that there's the right group. And my anecdote was, we did a study of relatively mild risk modifiers for complex traits in a relatively general population in Detroit, very significant minority enrollment. I did this with Colleen McBride probably now 15 years ago, and we explained the fact that genes weren't the whole story and there's an influence environment. And we found, to our surprise, people cast off Mendelian prejudice very, very quickly. It was in the context of their own health, where they had a personal investment I worry more about these interpretations that you're finding when we're trying to cast what we think about others, because it's very much easier to say, oh yeah, those people and their genes. It's harder to accept fatalism and determinism when it's your own life.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing I'll add, and I'm guessing Matthew has his hand up, and I'm guessing it might be in relation to this. The one thing I'll add is that for some of these properties that I talked about, we do have data from preschool age children looking at similar kinds of effects. And of course, preschool age children have already had a huge amount of cultural input, but they typically have not had a lot of formal education. And so that's a good test group for at least seeing to what extent is this possibly just K-12 education, in particular, something like the kind of science instruction that you might get in later elementary school and beyond. We do know from these younger populations, the preference for simpler explanations in the sense of fewer unexplained causes seems to likely be present in those age groups already. Data on stability is the verdict is out on that. We have some experiments where we're still collecting data. Kids might be different with respect to their preference for stability. There's, I mentioned already, there's strong developmental data of a preference for teleology. There's also developmental data of a preference to infer from functional ways of construing animals to thinking that they ought to be that way. And there's something wrong with the zebra that doesn't have stripes. There's something wrong with the boy who likes pink, and so on. So it does seem like in very young kids, you do find a tendency towards functional reasoning and then drawing certain kinds of normative implications from this kind of functional reasoning. So that's what I can say about the specific properties I talked about today.
Thank you.
So Matt, go ahead and ask your question, and then I want to take at least one of the questions that are in the chat that I'm just seeing here. You have a lot of discussion happening here.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that it looked like Nikolai had a question in the chat that was that predated me raising my hand, so I don't want to jump the line.
Okay. Could you please speak a little more about the structure of the populations for the experiments that you talked about? Who were you studying?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And I should have said something about this in presenting the data. The data I presented today are adult participants in the United States, recruited overwhelmingly through online platforms like Prolific Academic. And so they tend to be somewhat more liberal and somewhat more educated than representative samples. Some of what I presented has been looked at cross-culturally, but most of it has not. So the set of phenomena that I talked about, the two for which I know that there's some cross-cultural evidence has to do with simplicity and with teleology. And there what you find is some variability actually, where for teleological explanations, for example, you find that populations that have been exposed to less Western education tend to have a sort of broader scope of teleological thinking. With respect to simplicity, you find some evidence, although the details get complicated very quickly, that perhaps certain kinds of Eastern populations, East Asia, are more open to sort of interactive explanations that involve multiple factors rather than thinking about a single sort of internal cause.
Interesting. Matt?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. It was a great talk. I have found myself wondering when you were talking about the Verdexin experiment, and a couple of times since it's come up in the Q&A as well. What do we know about what participants meant or had in mind when they were talking about ought to? Because it seems to me that when you tell someone something's beneficial, if they respond, well, then everyone ought to have that. It could mean a few different things. It could mean I would like for people to have it, or it could mean it would be morally bad for people not to have it, or there's something wrong with them that they don't have it. So I would just wonder if you have any thoughts or data about what people have in mind when they say that or respond to that question.
Yes, that is a great question. It's something that we've thought about a lot. I think it's not the same across the cases I talked about. So I don't think it's the same for the zebras ought to have stripes and for the mothers ought to have Verdexin. So I'll speak to the mothers have Verdexin one specifically. So what we tried to do to get at it there was see whether or not people would basically restrict mothers' choice as a result of thinking that this was beneficial and that they ought to have it. And the way that we did that is that we told them that there was a drug that was used to treat nausea during pregnancy. but that it actually eliminated Reduxin from the bloodstream. And it's been FDA approved before it's prescribed. Women are told about the risks and benefits of any particular medication. But we asked participants whether or not they would agree with a policy that would not allow doctors to make this available as an option to mothers who are having nausea during pregnancy. And what we found was that participants were more likely to think that you ought to have this policy that restricts the option of having access to this drug in the cases where Reduxin did have that benefit. And so part of why that's interesting is because it's suggesting that people actually sort of do take those extra steps from an ought claim to something about regulating somebody else's behavior or choices. In the case of the zebra, I don't think it's like that. So we did ask people for, I should say, I don't think we don't actually have a zebra in our stimuli. We had these like novel animals with novel properties, but I'll stick with zebra because it's easier to think about that, right? So when we had the case where, zebras have stripes for camouflage, kids will endorse the claim, kids and adults will endorse the claim that zebras ought to have stripes. What we know with adults is that they will not say that there's something wrong with a zebra that doesn't have stripes, that a zebra without stripes is something wrong, right? They don't make that kind of a claim. So I think you're right to point to like the potential ambiguity or underspecification of all of these kinds of ought claims, but at least in the human case, I think we have a reason to think it extends to I don't know, the cases that make me uneasy. Let me put it that way.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for the many other questions that are in the chat, but thank you so much, Tanya. That was really fabulous. We're going to move on now to hear from Kate Lynch, talking about the meaning of cause in genetics.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Okay, hi. So is the screen and audio and everything okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so sorry, a slight title change since the program went out, I think. But I'm going to talk about the philosophy of science perspective on genetic causal reasoning, which has some very nice parallels to the things that Tanya has just spoken about. And because I know a lot of people here probably don't have a philosophy background, I'm going to start by talking about the philosophy of causation very generally, by looking at three main questions that people who are interested in causation in philosophy might ask. And the first is, what is causation? So philosophers for a very long time have been trying to figure out what is it about this very special kind of relationship that's out there in the world that scientists in particular seem to be interested in uncovering. What is it that links a cause and an effect? And there are, these views are still evolving, but there are a couple of very popular views about how to account for what causation is. One of the most popular ones at the moment is the interventionist account of causation, where if you intervene on a variable, say this variable here, C, and you change the nature of C, then you will see a corresponding change in the outcome that you're interested in, the variable E. So an intervention on C, changing the nature of it and not changing anything else in the causal background, should produce a corresponding change in the nature of E, and that's enough to capture what causation is. Another very popular account in causation, in the philosophy of causation, is the counterfactual account, and that simply states that for C to cause E, then if C had not occurred, then E would also not have occurred. And these accounts of causation, they're successful when they capture causal relationships and they're able to distinguish them from non-causal associations. So both of those accounts, the interventionist account and the counterfactual account, do a pretty good job in most cases in distinguishing between, like you see here, C causing E1. So if you intervened on C and changed the nature of C, you'd see a change in E1. However, if you intervened on E1 and changed the nature of it, you wouldn't see a corresponding change in E2. And so you know that E1 is not a cause of E2. And so that works in a lot of cases. However, philosophers are, of course, interested in not just the general easy cases, but the hard, tricky problem cases. And so it's cases like this which get philosophers upset when they're trying to come up with their account of causation. And this is an example here of overdetermination, where you have two causes, C1 and C2, and they're both producing an effect of interest, and they're what are called overdetermining the effect. So the classic example in philosophy is the outcome of interest is the window shattering, and you have Billy and Susie both throwing rocks at the window. C1 is Billy throwing a rock, C2 is Susie throwing a rock. They throw a rock both at the same time. The rocks hit the window at the same time and the window shatters. Now, in this case, intuitively, most people would say that both Billy throwing the rock and Susie throwing the rock caused the window to shatter. But under these accounts of causation, so say under the counterfactual account, if C1 had not occurred, if Billy had not thrown the rock, then under that account, E should not have occurred. The window should not have shattered, but of course it does shatter because it's overdetermined by another cause. And so you may think, okay, well, these accounts of causation, they work for scientists, they work in most cases. We shouldn't worry about the cases like Billy and Susie. But even in genetics, you can get things that fit these overdetermining causal structures. So this is a simplified diagram of the genetic effects for a Mendelian disease trait, osteogenesis imperfecta, which is a disease characterized by brittle bones, among other things. And this disease will come about from a mutation in two genes, COL1A1 or COL1A2. And these two genes occur in different parts of the genome on different chromosomes. And so if you have an individual who has mutated copies of both of these genes, then according to these popular accounts of causation, neither COL1A1 or 1A2 will be causes of osteogenesis imperfecta because you have this overdetermination causal structure. So these kinds of problems are still a problem in genetics as well as in philosophy of science. And then we have this additional problem in the philosophy of causation is that you have these nicely laid out accounts like the interventionist account and counterfactual accounts. But under these accounts, very many things count as a cause for any given outcome. And this leads to sort of an additional question about, well, why are some causes selected as the cause? Why do we attribute causation to some things or not others? Why do we privilege some causes, or why do we find some causes more important than others? And it's this question I'll be talking about mostly today because it's very relevant in the case of genetic causation, where very often when there's many causes of an outcome or a human trait, people tend to pick out genes as the cause or the most important cause. So again, to start with this classic example in philosophy, what caused the candle to light? Now there are a couple of candidate causes and they would all fit under most philosophical accounts of causation, is that the striking of the match caused the candle to light, but also the presence of oxygen in the room caused the candle to light. And under many different accounts, both of these things will count as a cause. However, people tend to pick out the striking as the match as the most important cause. So why is that? Why do people think striking of the match is more important than the presence of oxygen in the room? Well, the problem gets even more complicated because causation is a transitive relation, which means if you go back in time, the causes of the match striking should also count as causes of the candle lighting. So if there was a power outage that caused me to light the match, which caused the candle to light, that also counts as a cause. If the power outage is caused by a lightning strike, and if the lightning strike is caused by high incidence of storms, because we're, at least in Australia, we're coming out of a La Nina cycle, all of these things count as causes of the candle lighting. And the same if you go back on the side of oxygen, cyanobacteria produces oxygen. That's why there's oxygen in the room. But most people wouldn't point out at La Ninas or cyanobacteria as causes of the candle lighting. Instead, they point to the striking of the match. So they're doing this process of causal selection, selecting among causes to see which is more important. Now I'm going to talk about some of the things that tend to influence causal selection or causal reasoning. And these things, as I said earlier, very nicely parallel the psychology literature in philosophy. However, philosophers have kind of slightly different interpretations to the psychologists who are looking at explaining causal selection or features that go into causal explanation. Whereas philosophers sometimes are looking for something a bit stronger, and they're looking to find something that justifies causal selection. So this might feed into the question that came up in question time about which is the correct explanation or the right explanation. And just because I'm limited for time today, I'm only going to talk about a couple of these features, but there are many in the literature. And these features can be roughly broken down into things that are features of the causal relationship. So something about the special causal connection between causes and effect. And I'll talk about these two things today, specificity and a form of invariance stability, which we've already heard a little bit about. But there are also features of about the causal relata. So the things, the events, the objects that are connected in a causal relationship, the cause and the effect themselves. And I won't talk very much about this today because I know it's going to be covered in some of the later talks. Matthew Lebowitz has done a lot of work in this area. But there are particular features of either cause or effect variables, which also feed into what causal relationships are selected as more important. And these include things like how positive or negative these things are perceived to be, whether there's violations of normativity, and whether agents are involved. So one interesting thing to note here actually is that when talking about the features of causal relationships, things like stability and specificity, these are often discussed by philosophers, and as I said, they're sometimes thought to justify causal selection, not just explain it. Whereas when people talk about features of the causal relata, very often this is just explaining causal selection, and sometimes people even go as far as saying that these things bias causal selection. So there's this asymmetry here about things relating to the causal relationship thought to justify causal selection, and things relating to the causal ladder not justifying it. Okay, so I'll turn now to talking about some of these causal relationship features, starting with specificity. And as with many complicated concepts, there are many different versions of what specificity means in the causation literature. I will talk about just one today for simplicity. And the notion of specificity is probably familiar to many people here with a biological background. So there's a very well-known notion of biological specificity, such as the lock and key model of enzyme and substrates, where there's just one enzyme that fits with one substrate. So you get this one-to-one mapping of particular enzymes and substrates. And one version of causal specificity is very much like this, where there's something that approximates a one-to-one mapping between causes and effects. So you have just one cause producing one outcome and another cause producing another outcome, as you can see over on the right-hand side of the slides. And this is in contrast to unspecific causal relationships, which you can see in the middle, where, for instance, you see C2 has many different effects, and E1 is caused by many different causes. So that's an unspecific mapping of causes to effects. Now, this notion of causal specificity has been used, such as in the Bradford-Hill criteria, to give evidence in epidemiology that an association might be causal. It's not used to distinguish causes from non-causes, but it's used as a body of evidence to think that there might be a causal relationship. And philosophers such as James Woodward have said that specific causes are particularly apt for intervention. There's something related to specificity, which gives us control over an outcome. And so people tend to be interested in specific causes because of this notion of control. So that's specificity. The other feature of the causal relationship we've heard a little bit about already, which is stability, which is one form of invariance that philosophers of science are interested in. And this form of invariant stability is about how well a causal relationship is maintained over changes in background conditions. So I've got a little animation here, and you can see the color changes are representing different changes across contexts. This could be changes over time or changes in an experiment as you vary the background. And as you can see over on the left, C1 to E1 is invariant across those changes. That causal relationship continues to hold. Whereas over on the right, C2 to E2 is less invariant. The relationship drops out across some of those causal background conditions. Now, stability is thought not only to explain why people pick out causal relationships, but also to justify it, as I've got a quote here from James Woodward down the bottom. Both ordinary people and scientists alike value invariant relationships and are justified in doing so. And one of the reasons that they might be so valuable to scientists is Sandra Mitchell has argued that invariant or stable causal relationships, stability of relationships is one of the features for scientific lawhood. So she has this account where there's not just laws and non-laws in science, there's this whole spectrum of things that are highly contingent right up to things that are scientific laws. And one feature of scientific laws is that they're very stable. These generalizations continue to hold over many different causal background conditions. Okay, so that's in the philosophy literature then, so two features that seem to justify why some causal relationships are special compared to others. And now let's think about how these apply to genetic causation. So first of all, if we're thinking about, well, how these things apply to genetic causation, I want to specify what kind of genetic causation we're talking about, because genes are implicated in all sorts of different kinds of causal relationships. Now, you might be talking about very proximate causal relationships, say between DNA and RNA, as this is a very proximate causal relationship at a molecular level. And one of the first things you'd probably think about then is that, oh, well, the relationship between DNA and RNA is highly specific. So the nucleotide sequence for DNA very tightly specifies nucleotide sequences in RNA. Even if you broaden that out to something a little bit more distal, DNA to protein or amino acid sequence chains, that's going to be very specific again. But what I'm going to talk about today, and this is the focus, I think, of most of what we're talking about in this conference, is the relationship between DNA or genes and human traits, because this is the causal claims that people tend to be most interested in. They're not interested in so much these molecular causal relationships. They want to know, is there something special about how genes cause traits? And I've got here an example of tongue rolling, which is one of these kind of classic examples that people tend to bring out when they think about something that is genetically caused. Now, if we're looking at the relationship between DNA and the trait, there's still many different ways you can think about those causal relationships. The first is it's useful to distinguish token versus type causal relationships. And this is for all causal relationships in general. You can either talk about a single instance of causation happening. So we might talk about what happens to me if I have a gene that causes my tongue to roll. That's a token causal relationship. But you can also talk about causation in a more general sense, where you can say, well, this particular gene causes tongue rolling in general. So we're talking about, this is a causal relationship that occurs many different times in a very general sense. So it's useful to distinguish when you're thinking about whether there's genetic causation, if you're talking about token or type causation. There's also this distinction between, and this is a very broad strokes distinction, there are some boundary cases, but between qualitative and quantitative genetics. And qualitative genetics often concerns a single gene or just a few genes and the causes that they have on a trait. It's often called Mendelian genetics as well. And this is compared to quantitative genetics, which looks at the effect of many, many different genes. And the effect of interest is variation in a population, so variation in a trait. So in layperson's term, when people say things like, oh, tongue rolling is mostly genetic or tongue rolling is 80% genetic, what they're doing there is they're probably taking a quantitative heritability estimate, which might have found that tongue rolling is 80% heritable, and making a tight causal claim based on that information. And this is compared to if a single gene is identified for tongue rolling, and then that would correspond to a Mendelian gene explanation. Now, it's worth noting that with these quantitative heritability estimates, when we're talking about genetic causation here, it doesn't make sense to make token causal claims based on heritability statistics. And that's because heritability aims at, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a second, aims at explaining variation in a population and how much of that variation is due to variation in genes or differences in environments. And so a classic example in heritability studies is that the heritability of height is about 0.8, so 80% of the variance in height is due to variance in genes. But if we take an individual, so such as myself, it doesn't make any sense to say that 80% of my height is genetic and just 20% of my height is due to the environment. So I'm roughly 165 centimeters tall if I stand up straight, which I think about 5'5" for you guys. But 132 centimeters aren't due to genes and the 33 aren't due to the environment. It doesn't make sense to partition the effects of genes and environment in this way for individuals. So I won't be talking about those kinds of causal claims. Okay, so moving on to the single gene traits then, like I said, these can be made to make type and token causal claims. And one thing you might note about single gene traits, or often called Mendelian traits, is that they're characteristically specific. So, a very well-known Mendelian trait is blood type. The ABO blood group is characterized, there's just 3 different versions of the alleles, A, B, and O. They combine to form just a few genotypes, and so then you have just a few phenotypes that map to those. Sorry, I don't have a diagram there for blood types. But it's characteristically specific that if you have 2 copies of the O gene, the O allele, so an OO blood type gene, OO genotype, then you'll have an O blood type. And this has been recognized for a long time. The example here I have of osteogenesis imperfecta, it's not completely specific because there's 2 different causes for this effect, but that's still relatively specific when we look at causal relationships in biology, that there are just 2 variations in genes that will produce this disease. Now, it's worth noting that how specific something is depends on how the variables in a system are described. So if for osteogenesis imperfecta, instead of describing the outcome as a disease, we'd start describing the individual symptoms involved. You see that the mapping between these two genes becomes less specific. And what I haven't included in here is that there is also going to be other kinds of causes that, for instance, can account for things like hearing loss and thin skin. And so you have this mapping of multiple different causes onto the effects of interest, and each cause maps to multiple different effects. Now, there are additional good reasons why you might want to study a disease as a cluster of symptoms rather than the individual symptoms themselves. And philosophers have talked about how proportional explanations or outcomes are, for instance, as one way of getting around this problem. But it is worth noting that variable description feeds into these dimensions of causation that people tend to value. Another thing that is characteristic of single gene traits is that they are characteristically invariant in the stability sense. So it doesn't matter what environment I grow up in. If I have an OO genotype, I'm going to have an O blood type. And this is the case for a lot of Mendelian traits and a lot of Mendelian diseases. However, they're not completely invariant. It's not always the case. For instance, phenylketonuria is a textbook example of a Mendelian trait that is highly modifiable by the environment. So if you have the gene for phenylketonuria, you can go on different kinds of diets, which will alleviate symptoms and change phenotypic outcomes. And there's also the cases of incomplete penetrance and expressivity, where the phenotype, the degree to which the phenotype is expressed or whether it is expressed at all can vary depending on the kind of gene mutation or depending on the other kind of genetic factors in the causal backgrounds. So Mendelian traits or single gene traits are not completely invariant. They're not completely specific. However, they are generally quite specific and quite invariant compared to other biological causal relationships. And for this reason, perhaps, is why they're very often picked out as the cause. We call these things Mendelian diseases, which means we're pointing at the Mendelian gene as being the cause of the disease. Now, I also wanted to note that for a lot of these single gene or Mendelian traits, they almost always relate to disease outcomes. So there's this website here, Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man, which catalogues all of the known Mendelian single gene traits that we know about. And the majority of them are diseases. There's very few, which are things like blood type, which are non-disease traits. And having the effect of interest being a disease trait comes with other factors which are known to influence causal reasoning. So disease traits, as you can imagine, they're negatively valenced. So people think of them negatively. And they're also abnormal, both at a statistical level and abnormal in the sense of norms of proper functioning. So they violate norms of proper biological functioning. And both negative valence and abnormality are things that tend to make a difference when people point out important causal relationships. So that might also play into why these things are picked out as the cause when it comes to genetics. Okay, I'm going to turn now to quantitative traits, which represent most of the human traits that people are interested in when they're trying to understand genetic causation. And quantitative traits, instead of having these binary outcomes like disease absence or presence, they present in a spectrum of variation in a population. So the classic example is height. There's a huge amount of variation in human populations for height. And people ask the question, well, how much of that variation is due to genes and how much of that variation is due to the environment? And this is what heritability studies try to capture. In the case of height, it's pretty well documented that across many, many different populations, heritability is about 0.8. So most of the variation in height in humans is due to our genes and not our environment. Now, heritability as a statistic and as a method is very controversial when it comes to making causal claims about genetics. This is in the academic literature with scientists, philosophers, behavior geneticists all weighing in on this debate. And this is a figure here from a recent publication in Behavior and Brain Sciences from Madel and Harden, which has this sort of spectrum of the way that people interpret heritability results, where some people, such as Richard Lewontin and Ned Block, think these results are useless, they don't represent any kind of causal information, whereas other people think that a high heritability estimate might give evidence for a very strong causal relationship, such as genetic determination. And of course, then there's lots of people in the middle who have more nuanced views about, yes, maybe heritability tells us something about causation, but it's a very specific and complicated causal relationship. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why there's this debate about whether heritability represents causal relationships, because I think the debate actually hinges on one of these features that philosophers have been interested in for causal explanation, and that's stability. So as I said, there are many people who are very critical of heritability analysis, and the people who are traditionally denying the utility of heritability, their primary concern is how well heritability statistics can be extrapolated. So if you estimate that human height is 80% in a particular population, well, does that mean that if you go and measure another population, say in another part of the world, people who are growing up in very different kinds of environments, will heritability still be 80% there? And this is the crux of Richard Lewontin's argument in his famous paper in 1976, is that you may have a study that covers maybe a couple of different environments. Down the bottom here, we've got E1 and E2. And if you just look at what happens if you study different genotypes across two environments, E1 and E2, you can see that genes tend to be the difference maker. It's differences in genotype, which is explaining variation in the trait, which is along the y-axis. The genotypes here are the different curves. But if you go across the x-axis to the two different environments don't seem to make much of a difference. So if you just studied these two environments, you would get a pretty high heritability estimate. Now, Lewontin's point is that, well, what about the environments that we haven't studied? Or what about future environments? What if nutrition changes radically in the future and all of a sudden the environment makes a huge difference to height? Then our heritability estimate is liable to change. And that would happen, say, in environments E3 and E4. If you conducted a different study studying these environments, what you see is the effects of genotypes are different in these kinds of environments. And this is the phenomenon that many people here, I'm sure, are familiar with, of gene-environment interaction. Now, this is an image here up the top right from Lewontin's paper, illustrating gene-environment interaction in Drosophila, in fruit flies. And so this is empirical data showing that the viability of Drosophila larvae, there's this complex interaction of genotype with, in this case, temperature environment. So some genotypes are uniformly poor across all temperatures, whereas some genotypes do really well in some temperatures and not in others. And so this shows that what you can say about how much difference can be explained by differences in genes is going to depend on the kinds of environment you study. Now, the reason I think this is interesting is that the responses to this criticism, people who want to defend the utility of heritability estimates, they have two different flavors. They either come back and say, well, actually, gene-environment interaction is not a problem. It's not very ubiquitous in humans. And this is an empirical response saying it's nothing we have to worry about. Most things have the functional relationship as shown on the left-hand side of this graph for E1 and E2. Or people say, okay, maybe there are some gene-environment interactions and maybe there's the potential for them in some unstudied environments, but we can still make causal claims. They're just going to be more restricted. They're not general global causal claims, but we can make restricted causal claims. And what both of these responses are doing is they're talking about the degree of invariance that a causal relationship holds under. They're either saying, actually, it's an empirical fact that these causal relationships are maintained across many different environments, when they're saying that G by E is not ubiquitous, or they're saying, okay, well, maybe we don't need to worry about invariance as much as some people think. We'll just make a more local causal claim. And so this academic debate about whether heritability statistics represent causal information has to do with this dimension of causation, I think, which is the degree of stability or invariance, how well a causal relationship holds across background conditions. Okay, so just to summarize these two things here. So I mentioned that single gene traits tend to be characteristically specific and invariant, and this applies in both type and token instances. And the debate regarding heritability, which is a type causal claim, that hinges on whether relationships are invariant or stable. So it looks like both invariance and specificity appear to influence genetic causal reasoning. Now, those are the two features of the causal relationship. There's also features relating to the causal relata, and in the interests of time, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I'm just going to point to the literature and then hope that Matt Lebowitz takes up some of this stuff in his talk. But I just wanted to also note here that there seems to be this parallel between some of the literature for causal reasoning in general, which might match up to the kinds of things that happen in genetic causal reasoning. So in the literature on general causal reasoning, Some of the factors that tend to make a difference are whether there's agency involved, whether there's violation of different kinds of norms, and the moral valence of both the cause and the effect have an impact, or whether people will pick out things as a more important cause than others. And it looks like there are some parallels here in the literature on genetics. I've done some work, again, looking at these historical debates about the utility of heritability, which show that these factors also come into play. And there's other great experimental work which have shown that things like normality and naturalness, as well as valence, also have an effect on whether people accept genetic causal information or explanations. Okay, so just in summary, here are some of the factors that we know influence genetic causal reasoning. There may be more. Some of them correspond to the causal relationship itself, and these are specificity and invariance. Some of them correspond to the causal relata, either features of the cause or features of the effect. And there's probably many more and many things that we can uncover if we continue to do more great empirical work. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I can see a lot of connections between the way that you framed this and the way Tanya did. Tanya, I wondered if you had a reaction you wanted to give us.
First, that was a great presentation, so thank you so much. I thought it was really helpful to lay out the different pieces of how causation come to this case. I guess one question that I might have for you, Kate, would be whether or not you think there are likely to be any considerations that are unique to the case of genetic causation when we're thinking about what justifies causal claims, right? I mean, a lot of the cases that the properties that you talked about, I think, have been proposed to apply quite generally, not just the case of genetics. And then you highlighted some of the ways that they apply in this particular case. Do you think at the end of the day, the story about what we're justified in claiming is going to be just the same as it is in the genetics cases for any other domain of science? And it might just be about, I mean, maybe there's variations in the extent to which you actually find specificity or that you actually find stability, but that we care about them to the same extent and for the same reasons, or is there going to be something different?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if you're trying to justify why genes are important, it's most useful to then show why it corresponds to these other kinds of more general features, because otherwise you might get stuck in kind of a circular loop. Well, this is special about genes, and that's why we think genes are special. It doesn't really give you any extra information. But if you're talking about, if you're just doing a kind of explanatory project.
79th in Amsterdam, please.
Sorry, if you're just talking about why do people pick out causes as more important, I think there is some evidence that there are things that are specific to causes which we don't see in the more general literature. So I know Ilan Dar-Nimrod at the University of Sydney, he has this genetic essentialist framework where he's got 4 different factors which he calls genetic essentialist biases. And these are things that tend to be specific to genes. Some of them correspond to the general literature. So naturalness is one of them, which you might think is a bit similar to the normality stuff. But then there are others which they look like they're quite specific to genetics, and that, if you contrast a genetic explanation to a non-genetic explanation, people will pick out genes for those reasons. So I think if for an explanatory project, yes, there might be something special about genes. If you're trying to justify why genes are special, I think you probably need to appeal to the broader literature.
Anna, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for an excellent talk, 2 amazing talks. But Kate, I have an observation / theory, and I'm wondering if you would agree with it. And that's just that it strikes me that it would be hugely helpful to acknowledge in these debates, for example, the one about heritability, that causation is not something out there in the world, i.e. it's not something metaphysical, but it's always something that holds of our models of the world, i.e. it's something epistemic. And then, like, if we kind of acknowledge that and point that out, then we can focus our attention on our models, be they folk or scientific, and the assumptions that are made as part of those models. And I'm just wondering if you agree with that observation.
I mean, that's a huge question in philosophy, actually, whether causation is something that's out there in the world that we're trying to capture with a model, or whether we're just modeling associations and we've layered this kind of causal relationship on top. I think a lot of philosophers would lean towards thinking that there is something out there in the world, but potentially that it's that we're not capturing it perfectly with our models. So the features that we're looking at, like stability and specificity, might not truly reflect what's going on out there. And like I said, this is kind of reflected in how things like specificity will depend on the level of description of your outcome, right? So that's something that's very model independent. How you describe the variable is going to change how specific it is, and also what things you put in as a causal background condition will change how stable it is. It's very hard to determine that in a very metaphysical sense, because you could look at the world in a very fine-grained way, in which everything is kind of going to be infinitely unspecific and unstable, because there's just so many different things going on out there. So I certainly think it's more tractable to take an epistemic stance and to conduct this debate, without the metaphysics. That's sort of the approach that I generally take. But I don't know if I would go as far as to deny that causation is something metaphysical, because I think that could upset quite a lot of philosophers of science.
I know. I think philosophers of science are very wrong, but there we go.
Bob? Okay, Bob is saying, my sense is that familiarity someone has with a genetic cause. Bob, are you still here? Okay.
Yes, sorry. So
okay.
My sense is that often, clinically at least, that sort of the salience, so to speak, I think that was sort of Kahneman and Tversky's term, but if someone knows someone with a genetic disease, the disease that's caused by Mendelian genetics, that if someone knows someone with Huntington's or breast cancer or BRCA gene, that may then influence the weight they give to a genetic cause. I'm wondering just how that might fit in with the frameworks that you've been talking about.
That's very interesting. So I wonder, because often when people are familiar with cases, they're also familiar with the complexities. So, if you somebody with a Mendelian disease, you might also know that there are these modifiable environmental factors that can affect how much that disease is expressed. So yeah, I don't have an answer to that question. I guess that's an empirical question. I know there has been some work on whether genetic knowledge in a kind of general sense is related to having these genetic essentialist biases that Dan Nimrod and his colleagues have studied, and they found that there was no relationship between genetic knowledge and biases. So people with a greater degree of genetic background knowledge are still as subject to the biases as others. But that's not talking about familiarity in a specific case. I don't know if Tanya has heard of anything like this with genes or otherwise.
I was thinking about it as you spoke, and I wonder if Matt knows of any cases. I feel like I can point to something anecdotal, and I think there might be evidence out there. One of the anecdotal versions of this is just that when a lot of people say that when you have your second child, you start to take things like genetic influences on temperament seriously. That resonates with me. And I had my second child, and I think with a lot of other people I know. And then the other thing, again, very anecdotal, but I feel like I've seen this in many cases, is that people are often more inclined to appreciate that something could have a genetic contribution when they've seen it close up, right? So when they've, people might think that sexual orientation is just a matter of choice until they've, encountered, sort of seen it more firsthand what somebody's experience is. And so I wonder, I think Matt would know if there's data looking at that systematically, but thinking about those cases makes me think that you would expect some effects of just firsthand knowledge and familiarity. Matt, do you know?
Nothing's coming to mind off the top of my head. I mean, there has been work looking, for example, at, let's say, genetic essentialist biases about mental disorders in psychiatrists or other mental health clinicians who presumably have more familiarity, and they do generally tend to show, you can see some of the same frameworks of thinking about the workings of genetics in those kind of more expert populations, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head that's, like you said, systematically looked at familiarity in that specific way.
I think I'd like to make a comment too here that family history is, people have their vernacular understandings of the meaning of genetics, and they're much more ready to adopt a genetic explanation when they have a family history than when they don't.
So I think it works both ways. So I wrote about this a bit in a book I wrote a number of years ago called Am I My Genes? But for instance, 2 quick anecdotes. I interviewed a woman from the South Bronx who had breast cancer, the BRCA gene. And she said, it's really all the stuff that they dump in the landfills in the Bronx that they would never dump in Manhattan, where the rich people live, i.e. the white people. And that's what caused my breast cancer. And someone else who said, I'm from New Orleans and everyone has cancer, so it's not genetics. So I think people are busy sort of looking at a range of factors around them of who they know who has or doesn't have a condition. And then that sort of gets sort of added into their assessment and analysis of some of these issues. So
Yeah, that
just a thought. I can cut both ways, both that genetics is or is not involved.
I think that's an interesting case because it plays into some of the other stuff I didn't get to talk about, which is that attributions of blame also come into play for causal selection. So people are looking for a cause that they can lay blame on, which is why the agency, other human agents being involved can sometimes make a difference. And in those cases, it sounds like by pointing to these environmental factors, they're able to harness some blame. I got cancer because of the environmental pollution, and there's somebody to blame for that. Whereas, well, you potentially don't have that as much in genetics, although sure, in some cases you probably do.
We have a question in the chat from Bob Resta saying, in his many years as a genetic counselor, one explanation that he heard often, especially in the context of cancer and other adult onset conditions, was that my sister looked just like my mother and they both had breast cancer. But I look just like my father, so I don't think I'm going to get breast cancer. This is the vernacular understanding of genetics that I was just talking about, or just the opposite. I got cancer because I'm just like my mother.
Yeah, and I think that plays into, I didn't talk about it here today, but so Ilanda Nimrod's genetic essentialist framework, one of the biases is that things can be homogeneous and discrete. So if you have genes for one specific thing and someone else has those same genes, then you're going to share lots of other features as well. And that sounds exactly like what's going on in that situation. I'm sure he'd love to hear about that anecdote.
James Gordon is asking an interesting question here. Is causal thinking in medicine wishful? Simple answers invite the possibility of effective intervention. Anything known about this empirically?
Well, I certainly think that causation in medicine and in science in general is very tightly related to intervention. This is one of the reasons people are looking for causal relationships, is they're looking for something they can intervene on.
Yes.
And this is why those dimensions of causation are important, because if you find a specific causal relationship, you've found something you can intervene on with a great degree of control. You can get the exact outcome you want, or if you find something that's stable, you can make an intervention and you know that it's going to give you the outcome you want no matter the background conditions. So I don't know if, wishful makes it sound like it's unattainable. I think these can be useful dimensions for driving scientific investigation, as well as just explaining kind of the lay perceptions of causation, because if we think these are, this gets back to the metaphysics question, if we think these are real properties of causation in the world, that things are stable and specific, then uncovering them scientifically can lead to potentially better interventions.
Of course, we don't need to know the absolute proximal cause to intervene. The example of the Broad Street pump and not knowing that it was cholera or an organism. Matt, sorry.
Oh, I was, no problem. I was just going back to Bob's question, Bob Klitzman's question, thinking about, it occurred to me, it's not maybe perfectly relevant, but there was a paper a few years ago by Nancy Kim and colleagues, where they found that concrete examples of a behavior or a trait evoked weaker biological attributions than abstract descriptions. So it seems like it sort of would follow from that, if you apply that more broadly, that it would be plausible, I would think, that people who are more familiar with concrete examples of something would be less quick to jump on board and adopt a biological narrative or framework around the causation. I can put the citation in the chat if anyone's interested.
Okay. We are at that time for a brief break, I believe. Yeah, we have a break until 3:55 Eastern Daylight Time. So get a glass of water, come back and join us in 15 minutes.